Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second in the Shalom Hartman Institute Rabbinic Holiday Webinar Series for 5776. I'm Alan Abbey, Media Director of the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Tonight's topic is Hanukkah, and we have Yehuda Kurtzer with us in our New York office. The title of Yehuda's talk is On Terrorism and Nationalism, Reflections on Hanukkah in Light of the 20th Anniversary of the Rabin Assassination. The sources that Yehuda will be referring to in his talk are accessible by clicking on the link directly below the video player you're watching right now. If you haven't done it already, I recommend that you click on the link to view and download or print out your sources. The format for tonight's show is similar to what we've been doing in the past few webinars. There is a live chat module on the right-hand side of the screen, so feel free to use it throughout the program to make comments and ask questions. I'll be monitoring the chat line during the talk. After Yehuda finishes his talk, I will ask him as many of your questions as we have time for. Please make sure that when you enter your questions, you identify yourself by name and locale. Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer is someone I'm sure that is well known to all of you, but let me just say a few words. Yehuda is president of Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and a valued teacher, author, and thinker. His frequent lectures, articles, and media appearances have made him one of the most sought-after and widely followed Jewish thinkers in North America today. Without further ado, Yehuda Kurtzer, it's all yours.
Thank you, Alan. Hi, everyone. Hi from New York, so good afternoon. I'm honored that you're spending a little bit of time with us today to do a little bit of learning in preparation for the holiday, and as part of your commitment that we so value to the Shalom Hartman Institute as a place of thinking and learning as part of your own rabbinate. We're living, and I don't need to tell all of you this, in a moment of constant mass violence, and especially religiously motivated mass violence. And so even though it seemed extremely timely a month ago to come up with a title like this, both thinking about the Rabin assassination and its legacy for the Jewish people as we commemorate the 20th anniversary, a month ago thinking about the constant fear that Israelis were and are living in about random stabbings on the street. And now, after the events in Paris over the last weekend, there are many people for whom we can dedicate this to. But I would say the big theme that I'm trying to explore today is that we be in search of religion to be at least as much a force of good in the world as it is harm. And hopefully that religion become an antidote to its own ills. There is so much, as I said, religiously motivated mass violence. And one option, which I think many of us don't take seriously, and I don't want us to, is to think that this is an endemic quality of religion that can't be combated except from outside of the religion itself. So my goal today is to talk about religiously motivated violence in preparation for thinking about Hanukkah, and hopefully as a part of the moral conditioning that is very urgently needed for us as we walk through this very complicated world. To do so, I want to just offer two prefaces. The first is, I was challenged by a colleague recently when I was talking about the Rabin assassination, that is it a problem that we as Jews talk about our own complicit role in our own complicated history of violence that we've incurred to our own during a period of time in which Jews are being victimized. One of my rabbinic colleagues says it's tacky because it suggests that we are as guilty of this as other people are. And to me, I actually disagree vehemently. To me, I understand Torah as a tool for moral conditioning of who we want to be in the world, which is not always constrained by current events. It may be that politics, that is how we choose to act in the world, are constrained and conditioned by the realities of the day. But we have to be willing to separate the two. So our commitment to talk about the problematics of our own tradition on these issues of religious violence and the consequences that they translate for our own instincts doesn't mean that we make a moral equivalence between how we act in the world and how others act in the world, but it means that we at least take seriously what the process of moral conditioning is supposed to look like. That said, I had an experience 20 years ago after the Rabin assassination of studying in a yeshiva in Israel. And afterwards, after the assassination, the head of our yeshiva got up and was so offended by Yigal Amir, Rabin's assassin's use of the framework of Rodef, the biblical category of the pursuer, that if someone is charging after you to kill you, you are able to retaliate and pursue after them, which had been Amir's legal halachic justification for his actions. And the head of my yeshiva gave a talk explaining why the sources that Amir was using to justify his assassination were so problematic. And it always seemed to me, and still does, to be an obscene reaction, because it locates the debate about a perverse historical moment as though it's inside some sort of inside baseball banter about halacha, about Jewish law. And I'm trying to not do the same today, not to ask how do we think about religiously motivated violence in ways that give credence or legitimacy in any way to these actions, but I am trying to locate our own tradition's understanding of this large phenomenology of religious terror so that we can actually strengthen our own tradition, so that we can be in dialogue with our own tradition, conscious of its own traps, and better equipped to be advocates for the voice within our tradition that seeks to suppress these problems. I suggest a few ideas today, and I'm going to read some sources with you in order to express them. The first idea is that, very problematically, the core myth of Hanukkah is actually about nationalistic terrorist violence, originating, I think, in anxiety about powerlessness. That is to say, Matityahu, who originates the Maccabean revolt, acts in a way that expresses terrorist nationalist violence because of a sense of powerlessness. This, combined with a conviction to obedience for divine will, turns into zealotry. And that becomes the core story of Hanukkah. As we know, as I think is well known, over time this gives way in the Rabbinic tradition to a totally different moral universe. And the version of Hanukkah, as it's told by the rabbis, is not one of nationalist terrorist violence, but actually a story of divine intervention in history, precisely as opposed to the human intervention that is expressed in the early Maccabean sources. This is probably the case because of the implicit problematics of what it would mean to inherit this violent episode and to make a Jewish holiday around it. It actually becomes especially problematic as Jews become even more powerless throughout their history. If we were really obedient to divine will and that required of us to do acts of violent zealotry against those who are persecuting us, not only is this unlikely to produce the same results that it produced in the Maccabean age, that is, that the Giborim, the strong ones, would be handed over into the hands of us, the weak ones, but it would actually inevitably produce failure and therefore martyrdom. Or put differently, to do zealotry right requires being at the sweet spot of having enough power and agency to create havoc and to change political outcomes, but not so much power that you move out of that animating sense of powerlessness that makes the actor try to change the reality beyond their control through violent means. Put differently, what I'm trying to say is that what may have worked at a particular moment in history becomes a story that's untenable for the remainder of Jewish history, and much of what animates the rabbinic effort to remake Hanukkah is a consciousness of these power dynamics. That's one idea. It's a big and complicated one, and we'll try to develop it further. The second idea I want to suggest is that there are two anchoring biblical myths that are the source of this type of religious zeal or violence as an authentic Jewish idea that I want us to come to grips with. One, which is the place where we tend to go to first, which is the story of Pinchas, the Israelite who stands up within the camp of Israel and murders the chieftain of the Israelite tribe and the woman from the Midianite tribe in order to, because it produced chaos in the camp of Israel and it produces calm. That one we well know. And the other story of religiously motivated obedience to divine will translating into violent action is the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. I realize that suggesting that is a little bit edgier, but I do want to point out, and I will, that the rabbinic sources that we're going to look at, I think, are highly conscious of the problematics of the Akedah in this respect. In both of these stories, in both of these biblical accounts, what Pinchas does and what Avraham does is not supererogatory. That is to say, they don't go beyond the obligation of the law to perform some sense of righteousness of the divine will, but actually merely the direct fulfillment of the letter of the law. This in turn creates a problem for us as religious human beings. If all that I'm doing is obeying God, and obeying God involves taking violent life, which in Pinchas actually results in the death of those who he goes after, and Abraham does not result in that death, but that seems to be incidental, aren't I, the religious actor, merely supposed to be an instrument for divine law? Doesn't that mean that every time that I see a disobeying of divine law, I should take violent action into my own hands? What I think the rabbis do very powerfully is they remind us that each of these actions of obeying divine law, taking the law into our own hands, and murdering as a result is actually a moral choice. That obedience cannot be thought of straightforwardly as doing what God wants, but it's doing something that God wants that involves my making a moral choice. And the conservatism, therefore, that the rabbis will ultimately introduce into the story involves a different type of attunement to the moral choices that we make. Or the final idea I want to suggest is that the rabbis, by unmaking these stories, by challenging and provoking these stories, and ultimately by remaking the Hanukkah story, are actually sending a radically different message about what righteousness means. If righteousness in these original stories, Avraham, Pinchas, and Matityahu, is about obedience, for the rabbis, I think righteousness gets translated into caution. And the reason I want to put it in those terms is because I want us to understand the Hanukkah story as an anchor of one story of righteousness. And it's not like over time we throw out that story of righteousness and we're doing an inferior version of Hanukkah. I want us to understand that the version of Hanukkah that then gets presented by the sages is a different moral articulation of righteousness. And the larger cultural argument that I think I'm trying to make here is that the battle against religious zeal, fundamentalism, and terrorism has to be rooted not just in secularism, not just in critiquing that use of religion, but it has to come from religion itself. What is a different version of righteousness and moral righteousness for within the framework of a Jewish tradition that actually makes us capable of standing up with an equally strong critique to the moral transgression that we see in this form of fundamentalism? Let's look at a few of the sources here, and I'll try to tell the story through the context of the tradition itself. The first source I gave you, which plays out this idea that the core myth of Hanukkah is nationalistic terrorist violence, comes from the first book of Maccabees, which is the oldest and probably the oldest story of Hanukkah within the historical lens. This book of Maccabees says in the second chapter, describes the enforcement of forced apostasy by Antiochus the king. The king's officers come to Modi'in and demand of the people to make forbidden sacrifice. And then in verse 23 on the first page of the sources, after the king's officer speaks, when he had finished speaking these words, after first the king's officer speaks and then Matityahu speaks and says, we will not obey this command to do what we're not supposed to do, a Jew comes forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar of Modi'in according to the king's command. I want to point out that the site and the setting are critical, that this the violence and the zeal that's about to materialize takes place precisely at the altar. It becomes significant later on. When Matityahu saw that this Jew was offering sacrifice to a pagan god on this altar, he burned with zeal and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed him on the altar. Put differently, the sacrifice becomes not the sacrifice that was being offered, but the Jew who was originally going to make the sacrifice. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, just as Pinchas did against Zimri, son of Salu. So this apocryphal text of the Second Temple period is highly aware of its own literary antecedents and is using them midrashically to play out Matityahu as a version, a kind of midrashic later version of the Pinchas story. Then Matityahu cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come with me. And here he is implicitly citing not Pinchas but Moses. When Moses comes down from carrying the set and sees that the golden calf has actually played out in the camp of Israel, Moses says, whoever is for God, come with me. And then he and his sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in town. The next story that plays out here in the Book of Maccabees tells us a little bit of the idea that I'm trying to suggest, that any act of obedience to God involves a moral calculus. The first moral calculus that Matityahu has made is that it's permitted for him to murder this Jew who's offering the sacrifice to avoid the idolatry. That's moral calculus number one. But moral calculus number two actually comes later in the chapter, which is the next paragraphs describe that the people who were obeying Matityahu were so pious that they kept Shabbat. And by keeping Shabbat, it actually made them vulnerable to attacks by the king's men on Shabbat. As a result, if you look at verse 41, they make a decision on this day: let us fight against anyone who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. Let us not all die as our kindred died in our hiding places. Or put differently, we're going to fight back on Shabbat even though it's against Jewish law. The way that I understand what's happening here is that the text is aware of its own moral traps. Being obedient to divine will, that is, to try to resist the forced idolatry to which we're being subjected, is actually almost implicitly and automatically translating into disobedience to divine law in other places. This is the moral trap, the basic moral trap of religious zealotry. In one hand, everything that I'm doing is about obeying the divine will, and as we'll see in Pinchas does not do anything more to Zimri in the camp of Israel than simply obeying what God wanted him to do. Nevertheless, the cost of obedience fundamentally is moral disobedience, and there's always going to be a moral trade-off, which I think the rabbis are going to try to correct later on in history. The last piece I want to point out from the first book of Maccabees is if you look at about verse 51 or so on the second page, the second fear that I think this text, even as a text that is celebrating and embracing this terroristic nationalist violence as the anchor for the Hanukkah holiday, if the text is aware of trap number one, which is that obedience demands also a kind of disobedience, the second moral trap that I think the text is aware of is expressed in Matityahu's anxiety about handing over the legacy to the next generation. And he gives this very long speech that runs about 15 verses describing that arrogance is become strong. You want to have zeal for your ancestors and for the tradition, but you don't want to go too far. Zealotry, this form of obedience to divine will, knows its own trap. And the second trap that it knows is that the second generation inherited zealous violence is always worse than the first generation. Because the first generation, Matityahu knows that he's standing up in a particular moment to do something radical in this moment in order to correct the flow of history. But with the kind of long arc of his own life story, may recognize that this is only a momentary act that he has to commit and not a commitment of his entire life. But what happens is that second generation is almost automatically going to inherit that zealotry as like mother's milk. This is what I live with, this is what I grew up with, and therefore I'm zealous from birth. And it seems remarkable to me that even in a text that's situating the core story of Hanukkah as celebrating Matityahu, celebrating this religious terroristic violence, it knows its own moral limitations, one of which is that obedience requires some disobedience, and second, we become very fearful that any act of terrorist violence, when translated to the next generation, is going to wind up producing a more extreme version. As you could tell, as we read through Matityahu here, we read through First Maccabees, as you can tell in the story, the text is drawing on a whole variety of textual antecedents. This is part of the intellectual history of Second Temple Jewish literature. It knows that it's actually drawing on biblical sources from beforehand, and it sees itself as a kind of proto-midrash, using those biblical stories beforehand and retelling them in the context of contemporary events. It's only 5-6 centuries later, with the birth of actual midrash, that the retelling of the stories moves from a narrative to an explanation. So midrash is the rabbis explaining the Torah, but in a separate corpus. At this stage of Jewish intellectual history, Jews are retelling their own historical accounts in reference to biblical stories that came before as a means of explicating those biblical stories. The two dominant stories that I hear playing out here, one very obviously is Numbers 25, and the other one less obviously is is Genesis 22 and the story of the Akedah. I just want you to notice, because I really want to focus on the rabbinic sources, that Matityahu and the book of Maccabees does a very good reading here, actually, of Numbers 25. And it's something that you miss when you read the story of Pinchas the way that it's constructed in synagogue. The way that it's constructed in synagogue actually chops Numbers 25 in half. And so you get half the story in the previous parsha, and then you start in the middle of the other, you start at the end of the second story. But if you notice in Numbers 25, the people begin to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab. They invite them to sacrifices. So here you have the sacrificial theme from is being picked up by Maccabees from Numbers. Israel vayitzamed Israel leBaal Peor. Israel attaches itself to Baal Peor in the third verse. And then the direct commandment from God comes in verse number 4, which is oftentimes lost on understanding Pinchas as zealot, because zealot sometimes conveys the idea that I'm doing something beyond the letter of the law, when in fact, if you read verse 4 carefully, everything that Pinchas does is a literal obedience to God's will because nobody else does it. In verse 4, Vayomer Adonai al Moshe, Kach et kol rashi ha'am v'hoka otam la'Adonai neged hashamesh, vayashov charon af Adonai Yisrael. God says to Moses, take the chiefs of the people and hang them, or perhaps literally crucify them in front of God, in front of the sun. And the consequence of doing this will be that God's anger ends. Moshe says to the judges of Israel, not what God instructs him to do. Moshe does this often, by the way. And for another day, it would be interesting to think about Moses as the great disobedient, but not for today. He's the great translator of God's will. Moses says to the judges of Israel, go kill the people who are attached to Baal Peor. But remember, that wasn't the actual instruction. The instruction wasn't kill the people who are attached to Baal Peor. It was take the leaders and crucify them. And behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family, and he essentially begins to commit the sex act in the camp of Israel. Verse 7, when Pinchas son of Eleazar saw what was happening, he rose and took a spear in his hand. Now again, the building of the drama conveys the idea that Pinchas is doing something that involves kind of his own will. But what he literally winds up doing, right, which is Vayavo achar Ish Israel, he went after the man of Israel, verse 8, into the inner room, and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her body, and stops the plague, suggests that he actually is literally obeying what God had said in verse 4. This is actually fascinating, because it means that Pinchas's actions are not stepping in where nowhere else will act and doing something that far exceeds what he's being asked to do, but it's a literal obedience of God's instructions to Moshe that Moshe seems to have botched. Or put differently, what Pinchas is doing as a zealot is merely obeying the law as it's being told by God. Pinchas does not go beyond the letter of what he's being asked to do, but he simply obeys directly God's commands. This actually becomes then echoed in Genesis 22. In Abraham's famous and somewhat ludicrous actions in verses 8 through 11, where Abraham is walking up the mountain with Yitzchak. Yitzchak notices that there's no animal for sacrifice. Note again the context of sacrifice, which is now a shared theme between all of these texts. It's a moment of sacrifice, a moment of either sacrifice of animal, or in this case, in all cases, sacrifice of animal gives way to sacrifice of people. Isaac says to his father, where's the animal? Abraham says, God will provide the lamb for a burnt offering. We could spend all day unpacking this. We could spend probably the rest of our life. When they come to the place which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there, laid the wood in order, bound Yitzchak his son, laid him on the altar upon the wood, and Abraham put forth his son and took the knife to slay his son. Now, it almost is irrelevant that the sacrifice gets stopped here. And again, if we were talking exclusively about Akedat Yitzchak, there's plenty to talk about. What happens, though, is in our religious imagination, what becomes valorized of Akedat Yitzchak is Abraham's obedience to God's command with the willingness to sacrifice his son. That is, in places where animal sacrifice is supposed to take place, human sacrifice almost inevitably follows, either by the one who is instructed to do so, which is Abraham, or by those who have to intervene to prevent the wrong sacrifice, namely Pinchas and Matityahu. The risk of Genesis 22 is that we ultimately are in some ways idealizing the possibility of the alternate outcome, that is the death of the son at the hands of the father. We're making possible that that's part of being obedient to God, is the possibility of murder on the altar of Israel as opposed to sacrifice on the altar of Israel. Now, all of this gets unmade by the rabbinic sources that I want to lay forward. The first and the most obvious place where this happens is the Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin 81b, which has an extended, almost homily, but rabbinic interpretation of the Pinchas story. And I just want to point out a few things in this extended text. It's a magnificent moment of rabbinic interpretation that you can feel the rabbis looking at the Pinchas story and being scared by it. For all of the anxieties I suggested at the beginning, the more that people feel that obedience to divine will requires them to take their actions into their own hands, when they're not at the sweet spot of both knowing exactly what God wants of them and where they don't necessarily have agency that their actions will result in changing the realities in front of them, all you produce is the risk of tremendous death and misperformance of divine will. Or maybe I'll say it more simply. If the theology of obedience to God involves also being disobedient to other aspects of divine will, you better be really damn sure that you're getting it right. Because if you're not damn sure that you're getting it right, then the risk of disobedience is much higher than the gains that could come with obedience. And the way that the rabbis unmake this is the first line in the Gemara about this story is Habali malech ein morin lo. If a zealot comes to take counsel about whether to punish those who are supposed to punish, we do not instruct him to do so. This is a devastating critique. What the rabbis are essentially saying is, we can only understand zealotry if we see it as a kind of blind action that never gets consulted. But once it enters into the interpretive process, the calculus between doing so or not doing so, we never instruct it and we never allow it. And then the rabbis go one step further. Rabbi Bar Chana said in Rabbi Yochanan's name, what is more, had Zimri forsaken his mistress and Pinchas slain him, Pinchas would have been executed on his account. That is, the only reason why Pinchas gets away with his act of zealotry as divine obedience is because all of the stars were aligned. And what you hear the rabbis suggesting is, unless you know exactly that what you are doing is perfect, the risk of disobedience is much higher than the risk involved with obedience. The other piece I wanted to just point out in this Gemara, and again, we could spend a lot of time here, and it's worth actually reading. It's worth reading the whole text as a counter text to Numbers 25. The rabbis almost work through every piece of that text to undo it in Sanhedrin 82a. But look down at on page 8, Sanhedrin 82a, where Rabbi Yochanan says, 6 miracles were wrought for Pinchas. Number 1, that Zimri should have withdrawn from his sexual encounter with a woman but did not. That is, by staying in the sexual embrace for too long, he gave time for Pinchas to be able to time it perfectly, to be able to spear the two of them in flagrante delicto. Number 2, he should have cried out for help, but he did not. Number 3, he, Pinchas, succeeded in driving his spear exactly through the sexual organs of the man and the woman. Number 4, they didn't slip off the spear, and therefore he was able to crucify them, as was the direct divine commandment in Numbers 25. Number 5, an angel came and lifted up the lintel. Number 6, an angel came down and wrought destruction among the people. What the rabbis are saying by introducing these 6 miracles is, again, if you're going to play in this terrain of the anxiety generated at the sweet spot between power and powerlessness that makes you think that the obedience to the divine will is the only way that it's going to bring about justice in the world, you better have miracles on your side. Because if you don't have miracles on your side, then you're actually just a murderer. And that's the coarse, that is the coarse distinction that I think the rabbis are trying to do. They're trying to hold up a mirror to the work of obedience to the divine will and saying, unless the situation lines up in a perfect way, and I think they know that there's still a fraction of a percent where they have to tolerate obedience to divine will as it translates into the violent actions. They have to make that part of the lexicon because we've inherited Numbers and we've inherited Genesis. If that's the case, you better make virtually 100% sure that miracles are on your side. In the absence of those miracles, you slip very quickly, not just to doing something that's disobedient, but actually to being so wrong, so incredibly morally wrong, that you're liable for your own life. This is what I talked about at the beginning, the distinction, the move that the rabbis are making, that righteousness moves from being obedient to what you think is the direct message of God's will, to caution in how you interpret God's will. I want to look in particular at the next three Talmudic texts, because I think they tell this story even more elaborately. First, Shavuot 34a on page 10. Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach describes, "May I not see the consolation of Zion?" That is like, I swear by X, right? That is, kind of rabbinic idiom of, this really happened, guys, this really happened. "If I did not see a man running after his neighbor into a ruin." So one is chasing after another person, and it looks like he's chasing after him to kill him. And I think part of the reason this text is particularly suggestive is because the act of running from one person after another person to kill him is the literal rendering of the idea of a rodef, someone who's pursuing to murder another person. They don't use that term, but it's not too far under the surface. And he goes into a ruin, that is to say, a place where nobody else would be. "And I found him with a sword in his hand, with the blood dripping, and the victim writhing in agony." So put two and two together. I come in, I see that you're chasing after another person and you've murdered that person, and you're holding the sword in your hand, right? From the perspective of most criminal law, this is what we know as circumstantial evidence, and it's a pretty good one. "And I said to him, Rasha, a wicked one, who killed this man? It's either me or it's you. There's nobody else here. But what can I do, since your blood is not given into my hand? For the Torah says, Al pishnayim edim o shlosha edim yumatameit. It's only because of two witnesses or three witnesses that you can actually kill somebody for their transgressions." In other words, the righteousness that Shimon ben Shetach is embodying here is a righteousness of a justice through a legal system, as opposed to justice through self-aggrandized commitment to carry out divine will in your own hand. And this is the reason why this is a great example, is because this is 99% of the way there. You know, right? You'll know almost objectively that there's no other witnesses. Not no other witnesses. There's no other possible perpetrators, right? You also have enough circumstantial evidence that you saw him go into the room chasing after the other guy with a knife. He's standing there holding the knife. You have the murder weapon. But the conviction by Chazal, by the rabbis here, is that what it means to be obedient to this tradition is obedient to caution. That if I allow myself the right to control another person's life, even if I know that they are liable to the death penalty for their own actions, I have imbued to myself an obedience to God that comes with all sorts of other types of disobedience. And the text nicely then wraps it up cleanly by Shimon ben Shetach says, Ela hamakom yifra mincha. God will exact retribution, and they said he hadn't yet moved from there when a serpent bit him and he died. It's a kind of rabbis packaging this up together. Guess what? At the end of the day, the evil get their due. I don't have to get too attached to the end of the story as much as to say the rabbis need to package that in a certain way to make sure that we don't believe, as we ultimately know to be the case, that sometimes bad people do bad things and get away with them. I think they actually are much more comfortable with that idea than the idea that we should be exacting retribution with our own hands. In Yoma 23a, however, we get a little closer. So if Shavuot 34a suggested the basic ideology of the problematics here, Yoma 23a gets a little closer. And I want to suggest that Yoma 23a, I haven't read this anywhere, so maybe I'm making it up and I could be completely wrong, but I think Yoma 23a thinks of itself as perhaps an anti-Akedah text, an anti-the binding of Isaac. Famous story about an episode that took place in the Beit HaMikdash in the temple. It was taught in a Braita. It once happened that two Kohanim of equal status, it's not like one of them was entitled to do the offering and the other one wasn't. They were at equal status, and they both were so zealous to perform the divine commandment. And remember, it's taking place again here at an altar, which becomes significant. They were running to ascend the ramp because they wanted to be the first ones to perform divine will. When one of them arrived before the other within 4 cubits of the altar, the other took a knife and thrust it into his heart. Murder in the temple between two people who see themselves as zealous obedience to divine will. Rabbi Tzadok stood up at the steps of the hall and cried out, "Brothers, house of Israel, listen. an unidentified dead body, citing from Deuteronomy 21, is found in your land, your elders and judges must go out to offer an eglah arufa. If you already have a situation in which, and this is Deuteronomy's great teaching, there's a murder that's taken place in the society, but nobody knows who did it, then the entire culture has to take accountability for it. It's a great moment in Jewish collective responsibility. What about us, Rabbi Tzadok asks? Who does the responsibility for this murder befall? Is it upon the residents of the city of Jerusalem? Is that the city where this murder took place? Or is it upon the priests who preside over this courtyard? Something is rotten. How can it be that a culture of obedience to divine will makes it such that those who are most obedient, most hasty in the performance of divine will, are actually willing to murder each other on the altar in the performance of that divine will? Obedience produces disobedience. This is a devastating critique that Rabbi Tzadok offers, but it's not the end of the story. The father of the boy who had been stabbed came and found him still writhing and convulsing. He said, "Look, the boy will be an atonement for you. My son is still in convulsions, and the knife has not yet become tameh, or ritually impure." The father says pretty much the most perverse thing imaginable, which is, now that there's this desecration, the son will be the kapara. The murder of the son produces an atonement for the people. It's hard not to hear this as a kind of perverse fulfillment of the Akedah. At precisely the moment when the people need atonement, they receive atonement not through a sacrifice in the temple, but by the father's willingness to actually let his son's body be the atonement for the people of Israel. It might be a little bit of an anti-Christian polemic going on in here as well, but what's critical is the following line. This comes to teach that they took more seriously the ritual purity of their utensils than the spilling of blood. Right, very clearly the rabbis articulate that murder, as a consequence, murder here is not merely about the performance of the divine will, but it's a perverse playing out of what obedience does to us. This is one of the most cautionary tale texts that we have of the rabbis. Here again, to kind of come full circle, both the Pinchas story and the Avraham story, and then ultimately the Matityahu story, involve describing a murder that takes place on an altar by people who think that they're obeying divine will. Yoma 23a closes the book on that story. It says, what happened to us as a people? When did we become a people that was so committed to obey divine will that we almost want the Akedah to be the model story for our tradition? That a father is supposed to murder his son in order to obey divine will, as opposed to understand that that act of obedience is actually an act of profound moral disobedience. The final text I want to look at, and then I'm going to offer some closing comments, is Shabbat 21b. Shabbat 21b is the famous rabbinic account about the understanding of the Hanukkah story. And famously, the rabbis say, what is the reason for Hanukkah? And they describe not the Matityahu story. This is like Jewish history comes full circle. I've thrown out the Matityahu story entirely, and instead I have this very nice holiday of the miracle of oil. We thought we had a little bit, but we had a lot. Now celebrate. It's amazing, and I understand this is just a little drush, but I think it's nice. If you look at the following paragraph, okay, this is Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the story of we had a little bit of light, but instead we have more. The following halachic example that the rabbis give about Hanukkah is amazing. We learned elsewhere, again, this is continuous in the Talmud, if a spark which flies from an anvil goes forth and causes damages, the blacksmith is liable. Right? If the blacksmith is in a marketplace and is hammering on the anvil and it causes a spark and it goes into the flax shop and the flax shop goes on fire, then the blacksmith is liable for producing a spark. If a camel laden with flax goes through a street and the flax overflows into a shop, catches fire at the shopkeeper's lamp, and sets the building alight, the camel owner is liable. Right? Also, people who are holding the flammables have to be also conscious of the fact that they're working in small terrain. Rabbi Yehuda says in the case of the Hanukkah lamp, he is exempt. The camel liner, why? Because the Hanukkah lamp sensibly has more fire than what a lamp might be. I think what might be going on here in this text is that the rabbis have done most of the work of trying to suppress the idea of zealotry to God and obedience at the cost of human life, they're trying to suppress that story. They did that in the first paragraph of Shabbat 21b. But they still are aware that the story of Hanukkah is flammable. Something about this story, about the idea of obeying divine will, of the obsession with finding light in darkness, of destroying our enemies' altars, of trying to restore God's presence in the world, I think they're terrified by the story. And the halachic example, therefore, is a kind of halachic rendering of the Agadic story that they've been telling. The halachic story they're saying is, your Hanukkah lamps, every time we light these candles, we're producing something that's actually a little bit dangerous, and be careful with it. My last comment I want to say is, through most of Jewish history, the Chazal story, the Rabbinic story, has been dominant, right? We have this anchoring tradition of religious zealotry as obedience to God, as a playing out of a kind of revenge fantasy in antiquity, which prompts this Hanukkah holiday. And a lot of what comes next, and I tried to show this in these rabbinic sources, is a sanitizing of that message because of the fear of it. Because we are aware that those types of obedience to divine will results in all sorts of disobedience, and that the possibility that you're actually doing what God wants is counterweighed by the likelihood that you're doing a lot of things that God doesn't want of you. Zionism says to Jewish history that we want to re-enter, and that we don't really have the rabbi's option of simply trying to not be as full engagers in our own history. I guess the idea that I want to leave us with, because I think we're so mindful of the flagrant quality of religion in service of obedience to God, what happens when people think that their right to obey God's will can result in murdering people who they think are insufficiently obedient. I think our cautionary word for Zionism as we think about Hanukkah is handle with care. This is our commitment to our tradition is flammable. I think that's part of what's underneath the surface. The belief that that we're playing out a commitment to a story that involves obedience to something that's right is such a profound cautionary tale, not just for us as we watch the members of other religions struggle with this problem, but for us thinking about this as well. I shared the piece by my colleague Tomer Persico, who cites the writings of Gershom Shalom in the early 20th century, saying that the re-entry of Jews into history, we think we're going to simply secularize our tradition, take this apocalyptic Hebrew language, and we're going to be as good a moral people as we can be. I think we're doing pretty well, but Hanukkah for me is as much a cautionary holiday as anything else. That the holiday that celebrates Jewish nationalism, that roots its story of Jewish nationalism in obedience to divine will, has to be cushioned with the anxiety of the rabbis. If you're going to do this, you better be right, and you're so unlikely to be right that you are likely to perpetrate something that you can never undo. And with that spirit, I think about the moment that we as a Jewish people had to endure 20 years ago, when the commitment by a certain individual thinking that he was obeying divine will was not accompanied by the set of miracles that Pinchas was given, and was so profoundly violating the ethic of caution, the ethic that characterizes rabbinic righteousness, that it constituted perhaps the most flammable act in Jewish history.
Thank you, Yehuda, for that provocative commentary. As I await some questions from the readers, I'd like to take the opportunity maybe to ask one myself. Okay, so 20 years ago, there was an extremist act that, as you say, went beyond what the rabbis and what has been healthy, maybe the worst act in Jewish history. Did that act itself, in fact, light up, shall we say, more fanaticism, or did it in fact shock us into a more of this cautionary view of Hanukkah as dangerous, potentially dangerous, if fanaticism overtakes other factors?
So we can ask that kind of sociologically descriptively, which I'm not sure I'm the right person to do. I'm reminded of this section at the end of the chapter of the Book of Maccabees, where Matityahu warns his children and grandchildren. And what's amazing about that warning is that he saw himself as his actions were right, and he, in that moment, warned his children and grandchildren about, in other words, we have to continue this fight, but don't be like me. And it seems to me that that idea is actually on the decline. The people who are the most fanatical voices are actually not the people who are saying, I'm being fanatical in this moment, but you shouldn't be fanatical after me. The people who are most fanatical are most obsessed and committed to reproducing their ideology in others. I find it devastating that these ideologies, these pernicious ideologies, are actually on the rise, I think, for the Jewish people since the Rabin assassination. I think there was a brief period of what was known as cheshbon hanefesh, kind of taking stock of our own soul as a people and where have we gone, but that the people who were least likely to undertake those efforts were the ones who were most culpable in the production of these ideologies. And there's a lot of good evidence and good data that those ideologies were not weakened at all by the Rabin assassination, but were actually given more oxygen. But as I said at the outset, I think part of the moral obligation then becomes for us, how do we promote it's not the alternative story of Hanukkah, it became the normative story of Hanukkah. But not a normative story of Hanukkah simply because the rabbis didn't like the Hasmoneans. And it wasn't the rabbis' version was not simply, it wasn't an ignorance of history. It was actually a very mindful understanding of history. It was actually a commitment that righteousness and obedience to divine will has to translate into a commitment to caution rather than a commitment to the kind of conviction that the rabbis see as so profoundly flammable.
Wasn't it possibly, though, that in the time that the rabbis were writing this, they didn't have the political sovereignty or political power, and therefore you said they were terrified by the story because they were afraid of what might happen in a time when the Jewish people did not have sovereignty or power in their own land. And now that there is Jewish sovereignty in their own land, is it more something that has to be more protected, or is it less dangerous or more dangerous?
Well, that's the evil inclination, right? Which is to imagine that we now turn back the clock because we have moved out of that framework. But the truth is, none of these stories are actually sovereignty stories. The story of Abraham, the story of Pinchas, and even the story of Matityahu are stories that reflect actually a sufficient amount of powerlessness, which produces the anxiety to try to reverse that paradigm. We don't actually. The idea that a person would say Zion is a means that now that we're powerful we can reclaim the biblical stories means you're either misunderstanding Zionism or misunderstanding the biblical stories. Those were stories that also imagined their own powerlessness. And there's nothing scarier, I think, than the idea that you would transform the Jewish political circumstances to a place of unprecedented power and try to reclaim this culture of divine obedience. If anything, now the version of the caution, the hesitation that's offered by the rabbis is even more poignant. And here, just going back to source 6, Alan, Shavuot 34a, Shimon ben Shetach is the head of the court. And he's saying, even though I'm in charge of this court and I'm a leader of this civilization, I am going to see myself as obedient to divine will through the structures of the system of justice that's been created, as opposed to the conviction of my own will. And if there's that, as all of these texts, is the most powerful articulation of what it means that for a person of righteousness, suppressing that culture of obedience to divine will is actually so morally urgent, because the alternative is devastating.
Rabbi Daniel Graber has this comment, and I think it's adding on in some ways to what you said and raising some more questions of how we respond. It says, the rabbis seem to back away from efforts to claim an understanding of God's will in history. How do we continue to see religious meaning in the state of Israel, such as saying Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut, the prayer for the state of Israel, if we can never truly know God's will in history?
So David Hartman writes actually in The God Who Hates Lies about differentiating between, I'm going to forget the phrase, but something like a theology of an explanation versus a theology of response. And he's building off of Soloveitchik, and I think it's a critical question. There's a difference between the act of saying, I understand that God has returned into history, versus the act of saying, I understand that my role in history has radically changed, and therefore I need to condition my actions accordingly. The dangerous cocktail that I think I'm trying to avoid here, and I think we're trying to avoid, is that the two are inherently linked. That I make a fundamentalist understanding as though I can understand empirically that God has returned into history, and that because God has returned into history, God is speaking directly to me and commanding me to act in particular ways. There's nothing more dangerous than that. That's Pinchas and Matityahu. I think the reason why we make this distinction is I can say with great humility, I have no idea what's happening in the world, but I feel that my responsibilities have changed. And when I do that, I actually put the moral obligation on myself as a person who is a seeker and interpreter of divine will, as opposed to the kind of moral laziness of, well, obviously I'm supposed to do X because God has returned into history. I think part of what the rabbis are doing is actually, it's not, okay, now Zionism has come around, now we have to be people of moral responsibility. Actually, lazy Zionism is one that says that my actions are dictated for me because X, Y, and Z happened in history. Moral responsibility is actually in the hands of the rabbis, because they're saying it's precisely because you can't speak with certainty about what's happening in the world around you that the depths or the extent of your moral responsibility actually begins to kick in. I do believe that this is the big project, which is how do you surface and sustain a non-lazy, deeply morally responsible culture of Zionism that is both conscious that we're living in unprecedented opportunity, political circumstance, and so on, but wants to retain the ethos that the rabbis have yielded us. I think the other people who are doing the interpretation, the fundamentalist interpretation of this is actually is lazier and cheaper. Just because history has changed doesn't mean that our culture of moral responsibility diminishes.
I think you anticipated here a comment from Dennis Linson, who says, if those who need it most are least likely to engage in introspection, reactions toward their own interpretation of who is a Rodef, how do we hold the mirror to them to cause an internal change and eventually a change in behavior? So you say this is the great project. The next step is how to begin steps toward implementing that. I think that's what this question is getting at.
Look, let me make a broad, sweeping, and probably totally irresponsible statement. Post-Enlightenment, secularity thought that it was going to come along and offer a critique of religion by pointing out religion's absurdities, and that it was going to win a culture war against religion by showing that religion's claims were essentially untenable. In that respect, secularism had a lot of wins, but has predominantly lost. And the resurfacing or the continued embrace of religious fundamentalism by people of our faith, by people of other faiths, in these massive, violent ways, signals that this war between these two ideas and ideologies is not over. It seems unlikely to me that a person of faith could ever be moved away from their claims about what that faith demands of them by a secular argument. What I think could be a much more robust argument is not I mock your tradition and you should walk away from it, but you're reading your tradition wrong. And is there a counter reading that we can amount that could stand up with as much sincerity and as much commitment as the one that's being offered by those who are making what we consider to be lazy and fundamentalist reading of our own tradition? I understand that this is hard work. I sometimes try to describe our work at the Institute as trying to lead a mass movement of subtlety. That's tricky. The story of Matityahu is an easy story for people to rally around and identify with. This is why it was so easy and cheap for Yigal Amir to see himself within the framework of Jewish history the way he did, because it reflected a kind of moral laziness to take seriously what the counter voices are to simply seeing yourself as the embodiment of a story that came before you. I get that it's hard. It's hard every day of all the work that we do. But if we don't do it, we're simply either yielding tradition to the cheapest readings that are possible, or resorting to a kind of secular argumentation against a fundamentalism that's even less likely to work.
Well, speaking of textual readings, Michael Ragozin says, is there a limit to the religious and textual power to suppress zealotry? He says, we are witnessing a great rise in price tag attacks. Can religion really be the solution you want it to be when the geopolitical climate seems to be empowering zealotry?
So we'd have to ask what it is that that's happening that empowers I would want to know more about that question. What do you think about the environment that we're living in that's empowering religious zealotry? I think phenomenologically, religious zealotry and all of the stories that we're in thrives on public performance. That's what's the strength of the Pinchas story is its public performance. The strength of the Matityahu story is its public performance, and it's paradoxical and devastating that that form of obedience to God can only happen in these public contexts because that's where it draws all of its fuel. That it's so it needs to have that element, and that's why we know it as terror. Is Rabbi Tzadok's comments on the courtyard of the temple, on the steps of the courtyard of the temple, are they ever going to amount to as strong a counterclaim? I think this is the question you're asking, than the publicly performative aspects of terror and violence. And I don't know, but what choice do we have? Right? What are we left with? If you don't actually locate within the tradition the moral voice that says it's not you're obeying God, but I don't like it. It's that your act of obeying God is actually a profound act of disobedience of God, and it's only through God language that one might be able to actually make an argument that those who are using God language are using it wrong.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, even though there are a few more that in the queue. But I think this one kind of brings full circle back to Hanukkah. It's from Julie in Denver, and it says, if the rabbis are presenting an alternate reading about caution, why do you think this particular story about limited oil becoming lasting was chosen? Why was this story chosen as opposed to, I guess, any other or many other stories that could have been selected or invented or developed or articulated, I guess?
Well, it's a great question. And I would want to know what the options were before committing to my explanation. But I guess the elegance of the oil story is its simplicity, which is light and darkness, right? And that's the anthropologists look at Hanukkah and say Hanukkah is the Jewish version of what every civilization has, which is around the winter solstice, some version of a holiday that celebrates light because you're at the darkest moment of the year. And the elegance of, we thought we had just a little bit of light in this darkness, but we actually have abundant light, it's beautiful. And it makes the story, it takes out all of the geopolitical stuff of, I don't have light because I slaughtered other people. I don't have the light of political thriving and political success. I literally have light in a dark moment, and I'm able to be a force that's generating optimism, and in the periods of the most profound pessimism is actually an incredibly important story for much of Jewish history. That in spite of whatever we're surrounded with, we believe in the possibility of light. What I'm moved by, though, is even as a story of powerlessness, because Shabbat 21a is a story of powerlessness, a story of oil as opposed to war, suggests that I'm more comfortable with this metaphor than I am with its political ramifications. Even as they're depoliticizing this story, they're aware of its flammability. Right? Anytime a powerless people talks about redemption, it's opening up a window into a side of us that can actually scare us. And I want us as modern Jews to live somewhere between the first half and the second half of Shabbat 21b, of thinking profoundly optimistically about the redemptive possibilities for the Jewish people in the world, what moral responsibilities it places on us, what the state of Israel opens up as an opportunity, with the caution of handle with care. That the more rigorously and more literally we take the story of redemption and obedience to the divine will, the more we lose hold over the culture of moral responsibility that has sustained that story of optimism for quite some time.
Thank you very much, Yehuda, and thank you everyone for all of your challenging questions and comments. Before we go, just a few quick things. Coming up soon on our website will be a collection of many Hanukkah articles and video programs from the last several years, including in a few days this program itself, previous programs from Micha Goodman and Noam Tzion, and other articles and essays by Hartman scholars on the Hartman website for your use and passing around. Let me also remind you that we have 2 more holiday webinars in this series. In March, we will have a seminar on Purim with Shraga Bar-On, and Shavuot on June 1st from Ilana Steinhain from our New York office. It's also not too soon, by the way, if you don't mind one final commercial here, to begin planning for our 2016 Rabbinic Torah Study Seminar, which will run from Tuesday, July 5th to Thursday, July 14th. And please take a look at the information on our latest iEngage video lecture series, Jewish Values and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, which you can pre-order now. Well, that's about it. I want to thank you again for all your participation. Thank you, Yehuda, for your remarkable presentation. We'll see you again next time. And while it's a little early, we'll say Chag Or Sameach. And from Jerusalem, I'm Alan Abbey, and so long.